When it comes to current affairs, there almost always seems to be either a political or economic spin on things, or sometimes both. To clear away the vested interests and the pre-elections messages we are going to hear, we want to take a look back at the economic wins and losses of 2022 and shed some light on what we are seeing around us. For this, we have Trevor Tombe. He's an economics professor at the University of Calgary, as well as a research fellow at the School of Public Policy. Trevor Tombe, welcome to Bridge City News.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, some have said that the Trudeau carbon taxes have no impact on inflation. Can you explain the forces driving the inflation that we are seeing?
Sure. First, it's important to remember that inflation is just an average across all of the goods and services that we buy. So when the price of any of them goes up, that will contribute at least a little bit to inflation. And energy is a particularly important item. We buy a lot of gasoline and natural gas, for example. It's also something that affects the price of so many other things because transporting a good from point A to point B takes fuel. And so the carbon tax does, and its entire intent is to increase the price of items like gasoline and natural gas. So it is a contributor to inflation because it is increasing those important items. Now, it's not the reason why inflation rose as high as it did or as quickly as it did. So it's one of these modest contributors. It's really not something that explains why we wound up with over 8% at peak in June, and here we're close to 7% inflation still. But it is a factor.
So then how did we get where we are today then?
So there's really three things going on. First is energy prices more broadly. Gasoline rose, if you recall, really high, peaking earlier this year in May and June. And that's primarily because global oil prices reached over $120 per barrel, right? It really increased rapidly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's one important factor behind the acceleration in inflation this year. Another is home prices. Home prices rose dramatically through 2021, and they've been coming down somewhat since February this year, but that's been a factor in inflation because it's one of the components we measure for home ownership costs, for example. And then third, and most importantly now, is food prices. This is something that we see regularly, increasing grocery bills right across the country. Part of that is because some agricultural commodity prices really spiked following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But another part of it is food is a pretty energy sensitive item. When the cost of when the cost of fuel rises, then so too typically does the cost of food. And so there's a lot of interconnections between all of these items, but I think inflation's largely an energy and food plus real estate story in Canada.
I know I still joke with people that, the food has gotten so expensive. I can now brag that, hey, I can now carry $200 worth of groceries with one hand.
Yes.
So
well, hopefully that doesn't last for too much longer.
Hopefully not. So Trevor, what will it take for inflation to begin to decrease?
Well, many of these factors that I just mentioned have already decreased dramatically. I mean, we're now with global oil prices below $80 per barrel, so that's significant. That's brought down gasoline prices quite a bit relative to where they were earlier this year. Home prices too, depending on where you live. Different cities are experiencing things in a different way, but Toronto, Vancouver are down pretty significantly from their highs earlier this year. And so Canada as a whole is seeing real estate prices fall and probably will continue to for some time. And that's going to soon show up as a drag on measured inflation. If those factors continue, as recent trends suggest, like if oil prices don't rise back up to the highs that they were at before, and home prices, don't fall permanently, but kind of stabilize at levels that are below where they were last year, then those important drivers of inflation will dissipate. And then we're looking at inflation of around 3 to 4%, still higher than where we'd like. And so there's scope for other policy changes, but a big reason why inflation rose as high as it did have really fallen off the table in recent months.
Now, Something interesting, the Toronto Star recently interviewed the head of the Bank of Canada and discussed the idea that more Canadians need to lose their jobs to get inflation under control. That seems a little backwards for helping our economy. Can you explain that?
Sure. So, in fairness to the bank, I'm not sure that is a fair reflection of what their goal is. So they want to bring inflation down to between 1% and 3%. And that's their mandate. And they really only have one broad tool available to them, and that's interest rates. So when the Bank of Canada increases interest rates, that's going to tend to lower consumer spending on many important items. Residential investment, home purchases are one obvious one, but new vehicles, large durable goods, things that we might borrow money in order to purchase, spending on those items falls. And when demand falls, that tends to lower prices. And so that's one of the mechanisms that interest rate increases will decrease inflation pressures. But of course, there is a risk that economic activity will slow as a result. And that's almost surely going to happen. Growth next year is going to be lower than growth this year. And I think some are worried that it won't just slow growth, but turn it into reverse, and we'll see contractions in GDP. And normally that does mean unemployment rises, but it's not a guarantee. It's not a foregone conclusion. We could have slower growth, decreasing price pressures, maybe modest increases in unemployment, but off of just their historical lows, we might get back to a more normal, sustainable level. And that'd be an ideal situation. But if a recession does occur, and some are worried about it, then that could lead to increases in unemployment. But it's not fair, I think, to see that as the Bank of Canada's goal.
Now, it seems like almost every other week it's in the news that the Bank of Canada is raising its key interest rate. Do you think that Canada's central bank is rising interest rates too rapidly?
It has increased from 0.25% at the beginning of this year to 4.25% at the end. That's a faster interest rate increase than we have seen in a generation. You have to go back to the early and mid 90s to find something comparable to it. So it certainly is an unprecedented moment for, or at least in recent memory, for many of us. Now, in retrospect, I think broad consensus is it's uncontroversial to say that central banks should have started tightening monetary policy earlier. And so it's unfortunate that rates had to increase as rapidly as they did this year. But, that's easy to say in retrospect. If we go back to 2021, there's still a lot of uncertainty out there in terms of the recovery from COVID. Certainly, many could not have foreseen Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So events kind of transpired that led them to increase rates very rapidly. That comes with more costs on us as individuals and the economy than if rates were to have increased more gradually. But hindsight is of course 2020, and so it's easy to, I guess, look back and point fingers. So I think they're doing the best job they can at a really, really uncertain moment in our economic history.
Now, you recently tweeted about the Bank of Canada losing over $500 million in its third quarter. That sounds like an astronomical loss and a big problem. Can you tell us what this means?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's something that we in Canada have never seen before. All the way back to when the bank first started operations in 1935, it has generated a surplus. And that surplus goes back to the federal government. So it was a source of revenues for the government, and now it's doing the reverse. It's incurring losses, and that's going to have implications for the federal budget. It's going to increase the deficit somewhat. And so what's going on? Simply put, higher interest rates are not just leading individuals to have higher interest costs on the funds that we borrow, but for the Bank of Canada, they pay interest when banks deposit their money with the Bank of Canada. Just like you and I might earn interest on a savings account, for example. Banks have about $200 billion deposited at the Bank of Canada, earning interest. So when interest rates rise, interest expenses of the bank rises as well. And we just haven't had a situation where deposits of banks have been that large and interest rates have risen as rapidly as they have. So we're going to see losses at the central bank potentially for 2 to 3 years. And the total amount of the cumulative losses is really tough to say, but somewhere on the order of 5 to 6 billion is not an unreasonable estimate. And so how we handle that is something that I guess we'll have to keep a close eye on. I like to think of it as something that's not conceptually different than just debt service costs of the government. And that's something that we're going to see rising for the coming years as well.
And the other thing we've heard about in 2022 is the Canadian government has been printing money. Can you explain why this is a good or a bad idea? Because it usually sounds like when you print more money, you're making it less scarce and therefore it's worth less.
So the monetary policy in Canada, the United States, Europe, Australia, Japan, many other countries in 2020 was one of a very expansionary policy position, lowering interest rates in Canada's case to near zero. And once you reach that point, then central banks, in order to stimulate economic activity even more, engage in what's called quantitative easing, which kind of sounds complex, but it really just means the bank starts buying bonds, lots and lots of government bonds. Bank of Canada purchased about $400 billion worth of primarily federal government bonds during 2020 and 2021. And it does that in a sense by increasing the money supply. And that is meant to boost economic activity and indeed boost prices. Whether it's a good idea or not kind of depends on what would have happened had they not done that. And it's easy, I guess, to forget now, but in 2020, the first half of that year, we were experiencing deflation. Prices were falling. And so they were needing to lean against that and try and expand the money supply to increase prices because they're mandated to target 2% inflation. So deflation is something they want to try to avoid as well. So what we're living with now is potentially some of the consequences of not the Bank of Canada alone, but central banks all over the world engaging in expansionary monetary policy, potentially being a source of inflationary pressures mounting through last year and maybe the first couple of months of this year. But that's since stopped. The bank is no longer engaging in that policy. Interest rates are rising. They're not buying any more bonds. They're letting them mature and roll off the books. So that period of, as some call it, money printing has come to an end.
Now let's turn our sights over to Alberta. Outside of the electioneering we're hearing in our province, what is your opinion of Alberta's economy for 2022?
So I think Alberta and Saskatchewan are looking at fairly bright economic conditions next year. Slower growth than this year, for sure. I mean, higher interest rates are a drag on our economies as well, but high oil prices, high agricultural prices are a net benefit to Alberta and Saskatchewan generally. So if we experience GDP growth next year of 2 to 3%, that compares to the rest of the country at potentially less than 1%. And so I'm fairly optimistic that that Alberta and Saskatchewan will have a decent year, all things considered. But it's important to remember that there's so much uncertainty. Oil prices can rise or fall rapidly, as we've seen in recent years. And so much of what transpires economically will depend on factors that are kind of fundamentally unpredictable. But at the moment, all the indications are that Alberta's economy is going to be in fairly good shape. The labor market is already, in many ways, recovered not just to pre-COVID levels, but has recovered back to where we were just prior to the 2015-16 recession. So we've had a very, very strong year and a half here in Alberta.
Well, that's great to hear. Now, one hot button issue that's constantly talked about in Alberta is our healthcare costs, which are enormous compared to other provinces. Some could use outcomes as a benchmark. Do you think the government can keep funding the same model but expect different outcomes?
So I do think some fundamental changes are required and will be coming down in Alberta and other provinces as well. So Alberta, yes, historically has had much higher levels of healthcare spending than other jurisdictions. despite the fact that our population is so much younger than where it is elsewhere. That normally comes with lower levels of healthcare expenditures. So when you look at our demographic structure and our spending, then that gap between us and the rest of the country is even wider. Now, in recent years, the pandemic obviously threw a wrench into the government's plans here, but they have engaged in some pretty significant restraint on spending growth in Alberta, kind of holding the line, not just in health, but in many other areas. And the gap between us and the other large provinces of BC and Ontario and Quebec has shrunk dramatically. And so, that's interesting. We'll, I guess, have to see if that continues. But a big challenge is that, we do have a young population, but it is aging. And it is aging fairly rapidly here and in other provinces. And that's going to be a big source of pressure on the government. So how do we address the rapidly rising demand for health services as a larger fraction of our population, ages beyond 65? That's going to be a big, heavy lift for the government. And it's not at all clear that they have a specific idea of how to handle that. We could see different models of healthcare delivery. I think an increase in the number of, say, private surgical facilities is one item that Quebec, BC, and now Alberta has started to pursue. That might be one way to do it, but it's going to be a big challenge. And this is by far the largest area of government, so the most important one to keep an eye on.
Well, I wish we could go on for longer, but that's all the time we have for today. But Trevor, we really appreciate having you on the show today.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Trevor Tombe is an economics professor at the University of Calgary and a research fellow at the School of Public Policy. I'm Naveen Day. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.